there's no way I'm going to be able to look at everybody all the time. So goodbye. I will. I'm really very pleased to be in Oslo. It's my wife and my first visit to this country, and we have just had a wonderful time the last week. We've been up in the, I won't pronounce it right, the Lofoten Islands, and down to Bergen, and it's been a joy to be here. I am going to talk about the themes in Coming Apart. I'm going to be talking about Trump, as Eric indicated. However, in the last couple of months, there has been a lot of publicity about me and from the States that you understand that I'm a white supremacist, I'm told. And so during the Q&A, I'm not, by the way, a white supremacist. During the Q&A, you should feel free to ask questions about anything you want to ask about. And don't worry about hurting my feelings. I've had questions asked that hurt my feelings for years and years now, and it will not be a problem. How did the United States elect Donald Trump? Since I was wrong on everything about Donald Trump for 18 straight months, I'm probably not the right person to ask that question of, certainly in terms of practical politics. I'm not going to be talking about the kind of campaign that Hillary Clinton ran, whether she should have visited Wisconsin and Michigan later in the campaign. But I am going to talk about some broad themes that I think made Trump or someone like him just about inevitable. And as for the next question that I'm going to be discussing today, what does this mean for the future of the United States? There's always a temptation when something unusual has happened to generalize it too much and to be too confident that it's a landmark change. I will still be making the case this has been a landmark change for the United States and not one for the better. Okay, first, how did Trump get elected? Well, he got elected, to put it very simply, because mainstream America, especially mainstream white America, was extremely angry at American elites. And they were extremely angry at American elites, not just in terms of political ideology, but the nature of a new American upper class that is different in kind from any upper class that America has ever had before. We've always had rich people and poor people in the United States. That much is not new. But one thing that in the 19th century European observers constantly said about the United States was that we had very little class consciousness. In fact, Marx and Engels explicitly wrote that the United States was not ready for the development of a proletarian revolution because American workers simply did not have class consciousness. It was very unlike Europe in that regard, continental Europe, and it remains so. America has also, for example, been exceptional in that envy of the rich has never been a problem for us. There has been very little of the kind of common attitude in, I'm not speaking about Scandinavia specifically, but I am speaking about Germany, France, England, and so forth. There has been very little sense of, if someone is rich, that means I have less. There has been very little, the rich have too much. It has been instead in the United States historically the case that people wanted their children to get rich or to get rich themselves, and they would say to themselves, I want to be like that. In return, the people who became successful in American society had a known obligation not to get too big for them, too full of themselves. There is an American expression that I doubt is widespread in Norway. They should not get too big for their britches, britches being trousers. That you should remain one of the guys, one of the ordinary people. And this goes a long way back. Alexis de Tocqueville writes in Democracy in America, and this is a direct quote, at least of the translation, that the more opulent members of American society take great care not to stand aloof from the lower orders. They mingle with them, they talk with them every day. I will give you an example from my own childhood. I lived in a town called Newton, Iowa, which had a large corporation, the Maytag Company, made washing machines, was located there. And the executives of the Maytag Company made good salaries, but none of them, not one of them, would buy a Cadillac, which in 1960 was the luxury car. And the reason they wouldn't buy a Cadillac is that would be too flamboyant. That would be lording it over their neighbors. So this is a long tradition in American society, and we now have a new upper class that is completely different from that. It has its own culture. It's a culture that is different from mainstream America, and it is a culture that is very isolated from mainstream America. How did this happen? It happened because of two very large phenomena that were not bad in themselves. One of them was very good. The first of these two phenomena was that during the 1950s and thereafter, America's elite colleges got very good at finding academic talent wherever it was and bringing it to those colleges. I will give the example of Harvard University, which I graduated from in 1965, which dates me. In 1952, the average Harvard freshman was above the national average in terms of test scores, but not a lot. By 1960, the average Harvard freshman coming in was in the top percent of the entire nation in terms of academic talent. The average Harvard freshman in 1952 would have been in the bottom 10% of the class in 1960. Harvard went from a place that had a lot of rich students, some of whom were smart, to a place which had a lot of very, very smart students, some of whom were rich, in a period of just 8 years. And the same thing was happening throughout the American educational system. Well, this is good. When I said I went to Harvard from a small town in Iowa. I would never have considered going to Harvard 20 years earlier. It would have never crossed my mind. It is a good thing that kids like me from the countryside could get into these kinds of places. But what it did over time was create a very different kind of culture on college campuses, especially the elite college campuses. It brought a great deal of academic talent together, and the tastes and preferences that are part of the people who were in this cognitive elite, which is the phrase that Richard Herrnstein and I used in the bell curve, were different from the tastes and preferences of mainstream America. That was the first phenomenon. The second phenomenon was that over the course of the 20th century, and especially the last 60 or 70 years of the 20th century, brains have become worth a lot more money in the marketplace. Just simple IQ, academic talent. I will give you an example. Think of people you have known, and I imagine many of you have known such people, who are very, very good at mathematics, very, very good at abstract things like that, at the very top. Some of these people are not very socially skilled. Some of these people actually you wouldn't want to take out in public with you because they just don't function very well in social settings. They're incredibly talented, but they aren't good at small talk. As of 1950, what could that person do to make a living? They could teach math, essentially. There weren't that many jobs which were reserved for people who were super smart at mathematics and the associated talents. What can that same person do now? That same person, because those talents are very closely related to skill at computer programming, can make six figures, a lot of money at Google or Microsoft or any of the other major IT companies. Or if they are pure mathematicians, they can go to what are known as the quantitative hedge funds in New York City, the hedge funds that are based on extremely complex mathematical algorithms, and they can make millions of dollars. But apart from that, brains became more valuable for the whole range of occupations. If you were an attorney, a lawyer in the United States in 1960, you made a good income, but you didn't get fabulously wealthy, because the kinds of work that an attorney did in 1960 was for private clients, and private clients who had ordinary kinds of legal problems. So you didn't make vast fortunes. Or you could be a corporate lawyer and make a corporate executive's salary, good salary, but not great wealth. Today, if you are a very, very skilled, cognitively skilled lawyer who can take a corporate client through the regulatory maze in Washington, D.C., and get through the regulatory rulemaking process so that the regulations help the corporation who is your client, you can be worth more than $1,000 an hour. If you are an extremely skilled attorney who can negotiate one of these very complex multinational deals, you can be worth a commission of millions of dollars. For that matter, suppose we're talking simply about executives, a CEO. How much is a CEO, chairman of chief operating officer? What is a CEO worth if he is running a corporation that has revenues of $1 billion a year? How much is he worth if the corporation he runs has revenues of $100 billion a year? The answer is he's worth way more if he's really good. And I use he rather than he or she, but that should be understood. There are a lot of ways in which the new upper class is not only more uniformly of high cognitive ability than they used to be, they are also much more affluent. So the result, and it actually would be interesting to know if anything like this is happening in Norway. I have no idea. The result is that we now have neighborhoods in the United States that are radically different from neighborhoods in the past, that are where the rich people and the powerful people live. I'm sure most of you in this room either have been to or know about the Upper East Side of New York, which is a famous neighborhood with Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue where rich people live. Well, in 1960, it was also a neighborhood where rich and powerful people lived, but only about 25 to 30% of the people on the Upper East Side had college degrees. The median family income on the Upper East Side of New York in 1960 was about $65,000. That's in today's dollars. That is not rich. What that means is that, yes, there were rich and powerful people on the Upper East Side of New York, but as a whole, the Upper East Side of New York had a lot of socioeconomic heterogeneity. Lots of different kinds of people lived near each other. Now the Upper East Side of New York, the median family income is a few $100,000. Almost everybody has college degrees, advanced degrees. If you go to Washington, D.C., if you know that town, there are about 12 zip codes, 12 neighborhoods that are the place where all of the powerful people in Washington, D.C. live, in Northwest Washington and the Maryland and Virginia suburbs that adjoin them. All of those zip codes are in the top half of the top percentile on an index of socioeconomic status. How does this separation manifest itself? All sorts of ways. The average TV in the United States is on for something like 36 hours a week. That's too much TV, but still, that's the average. Among the new upper class, they never watch TV. Or if they do watch TV, it's a very few select programs. The same goes for reading habits, the radio stations they listen to, the foods they eat, the way they raise their children, the kinds of vacations they take. In all sorts of ways, it is a different culture. Actually, in the book Coming Apart, I have a quiz that's designed to let people answer 25 questions to see how isolated they are from mainstream America as a way of getting my readers to understand how little they know about it. Here's the problem. In living in this individual culture, they have stopped understanding what the rest of the country is like. And that is what happened during the Trump campaign. Journalists, for example, 50 years ago, journalists were working class. A lot of them didn't have college degrees. If they did have college degrees, they were from very ordinary schools. Now journalists for the Washington Post, the New York Times, for the major networks, they have degrees from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Duke, Stanford, places like that. They live in these neighborhoods that I'm talking about. They have not got a clue about what is going on in Minnesota and Oklahoma and the rest of the country, and they proved that they don't have a clue during this last campaign. Hillary Clinton, she's the classic example of someone who has lived in this new upper class culture for a long, long time. In part, of course, because of her special circumstances of having been married to a president of the United States. But it was noted during the campaign, Hillary Clinton has not driven a car for about 25 years. If you've been driven around all the time for 25 years, that lends itself to a certain amount of separation. Some of you are familiar with the comment she made in one of her speeches that about half of Donald Trump's supporters are what she called a basket of deplorables, which she then proceeded to identify as racists and sexists and homophobes and so forth. That one sentence, a friend of mine has observed, may have changed the history of the world, because that one sentence just crystallized for a lot of ordinary Americans the degree of contempt that the new upper class has for ordinary Americans. And that erupted this last year in the election of Donald Trump. I myself was an opponent of Donald Trump's because I think he is morally and temperamentally unfit to be president of the United States. And I thought that then, and I think that now. But when I said that publicly, I'm on Twitter, and what I would get were a lot of emails, not emails, but tweets, saying very bad things about me. But a couple of those really caught my attention. One of them said, "You don't understand. It's not that we like Donald Trump. It's not that we think he has a fine character. He's our murder weapon." And I think that was a very broad attitude. So what's happened in that regard is that America has become a class society in a way it was not before. And this last year, we reaped the whirlwind on that. What does this mean for the future? Well, it's not good, because the United States, until this last election, still had two ideologies, political ideologies, that were coherent and each in their own way could call upon good authority, moral and ethical and philosophical authority. On the left, you had something which is very similar to the social democratic parties of Europe. On the left in the United States now, it is taken for granted that what the United States needs to do is to become more like Europe. And as somebody who thoroughly enjoys visiting Europe, it doesn't bother me in some sense that we become more like Europe. But I am on the other side of that philosophical divide. I am a person who believes in limited government as it was expressed in the Constitution, and I am what is known as a liberal, a classical liberal, going back to John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith and more recently people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. All right, those two poles politically did not embrace most American voters. Most American voters are not philosophically very concerned about ideology, but these were the two centers from which the debate was conducted. And up until this last election, I assumed that the Republican Party, even though it did not consist of people like me, classical liberals, that this was still kind of the central philosophical position. And I was wrong. Here is what happened that fooled us, or at least fooled me. White working class voters were traditionally 90% Democratic, voting for the Democrats. And that was true through the 1960s. Then during the 1960s, you had the Civil Rights Revolution. Then you had the Feminist Revolution. And over the 1960s and the 1970s, the Democratic Party in the United States started ignoring white working class voters, and especially white male working class voters. In fact, it was during the 1970s that the white working class male was increasingly characterized by the Democrats as a sexist and a racist. They didn't like that particularly. They didn't feel at home in the Democratic Party, and in 1980 they voted in very large numbers for Ronald Reagan. And they continued to vote for Republicans thereafter because the Democratic Party continued to move left and continued to become more hostile to white working class men. What we found out this last year is that there was no affection in that population for the principles of limited government. When Donald Trump came along, he's for big government, he's for crony capitalism, he's for all sorts of things that are antithetical to both conservative thought and to classical liberal thought. Didn't bother the white working class voters. They weren't interested in that. They were very happy with a populist message. I don't know what will happen with Donald Trump, but it's very hard for me to see how the Republican Party, after Donald Trump, goes back to being a conservative party in the traditional sense of that word. I think the Republican Party is now permanently populist. And furthermore, the Democratic Party is going to have to go populist too. Because the Democrats right now are faced with an incredible problem politically. I know Donald Trump is doing all sorts of things that may make him not only lose the election in 2020, they may get him impeached before then. But even if that happens, the Democrats are in very bad shape. If you take a look at the map of the United States and who voted for Donald Trump and who voted for Hillary Clinton, the maps are usually shown in terms of blue for the Democrats and red for the Republicans. Essentially, the blue just are thin strips on the East Coast and the West Coast, and the rest of the country is red in terms of governorships and control of state legislatures, as well as control of both the Senate and the House. The Republicans are doing extremely well, and the Democrats are going to have to compete with that. What does that mean? I am projecting that what it means is the United States will have both parties which are increasingly appealing to populist themes, and increasingly ones that are comfortable with authoritarianism. And this brings me to the last remarks I will make on this score, which go back to my own experience of the last 6 weeks ago, when there was a mob at Middlebury College in which I was involved because people didn't want me to speak there. The speech I would have given is basically the speech I just gave you. And so there was a kind of mob violence which the college was unable to prevent. You've had similar things go on at other colleges. You have people on university campuses who are making philosophical cases for limiting free speech. This is not just a handful. You now have a major part of intellectual opinion in the United States which is in favor of the government regulating speech. That is a huge change in America, where it used to be said, along with Voltaire, that I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That has changed. So I'm sorry that I cannot end this presentation on a cheerful note, but I think you've seen the last of the United States that you have seen in the last 30, 40, 50 years. I think we have moved in a different direction. It is a direction that is dangerous, and I hope that it will be reversed, but I don't readily see how that's going to happen. Sorry, I can't do better than that. Sure. Thank you.